The price of a thing is only part of the cost. A cost is twofold: what you pay at the beginning and the consequence of the action. There's a reason the common villain statement is, "You'll pay for this." Unfortunately, the latter half is much harder to calculate in a game of Magic, as that cost is often dependent on what the opponent is doing rather than your own actions. There are a number of ways to interact: removal spells, counterspells, protection spells, etc. These pieces also come in a wide range of costs and effects. Trying to figure out the appropriate balance between the effect and the cost is by far one of the most difficult tightropes to walk. Mortals, immortals, and friends from the blind eternities, my name is Samson Loreseeker, and today we will discuss counterspells and cost analysis. The first and most common factor people look at when analyzing interaction is mana cost, and that is absolutely one of the biggest factors to consider. And it's more than just does it cost 1, 2, or 3 mana. The mana pip requirement is another important factor. For instance, a spell that costs 1 and a blue will be easier to cast than something that costs 2 blue mana or a white and a blue. These costs become easier to pay for when you have lands that tap for more than one color of mana, but that incurs its own set of risks. But as a general rule of thumb, the more colors in your commander's color identity, the fewer pips of the same type you want in your spell's mana costs. However, a lot of people operate on the idea that cheaper is better when it comes to interaction. And to that I say, sometimes. It is true that cheaper spells are easier to keep up for other people's turns. This is especially the case in Commander, where a great deal of more expensive spells are cast. So having more mana up is not necessarily going to be that common, but having 1 mana available will be a lot more realistic to have happen. Hence the popularity of spells like Path and Swords, or, for this video, Offer You Can't Refuse and Swan Song. Far easier to keep these up than any similar spells that cost more. And the less said about free counters, the better. And yet, there are certain things that higher cost spells bring to the table. Upsides rather than downsides. See, I am a firm believer in the art of not giving your opponents anything. The reason that certain spells are allowed to be so low cost mana-wise is because there's usually some alternative payment. This comes in 2 forms: restrictions and benefits for the opponent. For instance, Offer You Can't Refuse has both. A 1 mana counterspell is a powerful thing to have, so it is only able to hit non-creature spells. On top of that, if it does counter the spell, that opponent gets 2 treasures. There have been a great number of times where I've had this spell in hand, and the opponent plays multiple terrifying creatures that I can do nothing about. Or, I successfully counter the spell, but then they immediately use those treasures to cast a spell that's just as scary. Regular Counterspell is a bit better in that regard from my opinion. It's a 1-for-1 trade for any spell. You will hear that term and similar terms a lot. 1-for-1 means that it took 1 card to answer another. A 2-for-1 can mean 2 very different things. Either it took 2 cards to answer 1, or you got 2 things out of 1 card. 1-for-1s, while not exciting, are important. Sometimes you need to solve a problem with a card for no extra value. Counterspell functions exactly the same as Disenchant or Murder. Trade this card to stop some part of the opponent's plan. Granted, the timing can mean everything. The downside on Arcane Denial doesn't matter if the player you're countering won't live to see the next upkeep anyways. But in, for instance, a control strategy, that downside is more drastic than one might expect. Letting your opponent draw 2 cards is not exactly something you want to do most of the time, since control decks are all about limiting your opponent's resources. That's the tricky part though. Drawing 2 cards can mean anything from 2 lands to an instant win. Restrictions are another thing. Does your deck struggle with removing creatures? Then perhaps you should run more counterspells that can hit creatures instead of non-creatures. Is your deck full of creatures that don't care about your opponent's creatures? Then maybe it's the non-creature spells you need to worry about stopping, one way or another. Now, in this next segment, I'm going to talk about some specific cards that I rarely see, that may be worth considering for certain decks. 3 mana counterspells, I feel, are vastly underrated and underestimated by players. Holding up 3 mana can definitely seem like a pretty steep cost, but if you don't run quite as many high mana value cards, then it becomes quite easy to play a spell and keep up the interaction, especially if you've ramped. And at this mana value is when the trades start changing to be more in your favor. First up, Disallow. It can be just a cancel sometimes, which is by no means a disappointment. It still stops spells that you want to stop. But also hitting triggered and activated abilities as well is a huge deal. Someone about to blast you with an Aetherflux Reservoir? Disallow. Is an Urza Saga about to search for an artifact? Disallow. Someone activating ninjutsu? Disallow. There are so many things that disallow can hit that a counterspell can't, and the fact that it can be a counterspell too is a pretty good deal for only costing 1 more mana. Next up, Fear of Imposters. An enchantment creature with flash that counters a spell, and the spell's controller manifests dread. This means they look at the top 2 cards of their library, puts one into the graveyard and the other onto the battlefield as a face-down 2/2 creature. If the face-down thing is a creature, by paying its mana cost it can be turned face-up. This is a deceptively strong counterspell. First off, being a creature means that it dodges many of the most played counterspells. Offer You Can't Refuse, Negate, Force of Negation, Fierce Guardianship, and more. Secondly, being a creature means it can also be reanimated or blinked, rebuying the counterspell later on for more use. Thirdly, you don't need to have the target to cast it. It can just instead be a surprise 3/2 blocker, which can easily trade with or eat thousands of creatures. And finally, that Manifest Dread downside is not as much a downside as you might think. Yes, it can potentially help fuel graveyard strategies if you don't have graveyard hate, and yes, if it's a creature they put onto the battlefield, they can turn it face up, but you have to remember, turning something face up negates any Enter the Battlefield abilities, and they have to pay the full cost, and if it's not a creature, a potentially powerful spell has just been removed from the equation. I'll also give a shout out to all the modal counterspells here too. Dromar's Charm, Confounding Riddle, Supreme Will, Teamer Charm, You Find the Villain's Lair, Amazing Acrobatics. Versatility is always incredibly useful, and having multiple things to do with your open mana is always good, especially if the spells can also draw cards. Then if no spells are cast that need to get countered, you can simply cast the other part and draw some cards instead before your turn. One last counterspell I need to bring up is a personal favorite of mine, Power Sync. X-cost counterspells are interesting, and soft counters are usually dismissed due to not being hard counters. But Power Sync is an interesting one. Some people will choose not to pay for a soft counter because they have something else they want to do on their turn, a spell to cast or some other ability to pay for. But Power Sync forces the issue, because if they don't pay the X cost, then all their lands that tap for mana get tapped, and any floating mana gets removed from their mana pool. I've used this spell to surprising efficiency before, stopping a whole turn as a result. And if an opponent taps out, well, then it can be a 2-mana counterspell, no problem. As I discussed in my villainy video, counterspells are often viewed as evil by a lot of players, due to it sometimes feeling like a personal attack. However, they are as essential to Magic's core gameplay as removal is. They're really just preemptive removal spells, but all too often people will fall into the trap of just running the same counterspells everyone else runs, and that's discarding hundreds of unique and still very effective options. Hopefully, this video will convince some of you to try running some other unique counterspells in your decks, as there are so many to choose from. I do intend to also make one of these talking about removal spells too, so if you have any suggestions, please leave them down below. With all that said, I hope you enjoyed the video. I tried something a bit different this time, as you could clearly see, and if you liked it, please tell me down below as well. Also, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and do all those algorithmical things. It may not seem like much, but it helps a lot. And until next time, please, take care of yourselves, everyone.